I hear there's something big going on tomorrow, right? It's the solar. Okay, does anyone else want to know what's going on? It's the solar. All right, some folks know what's going on, I guess. So I don't know about you, but Nicole and I, over the last we'll confess that maybe it's been the last week or so, we've been looking for those glasses, you know, the ones that you can use to watch the sun without burning your eyes out and losing your vision. We hadn't been on top of finding those in a reasonable amount of time. And so, earlier in the summer, you could have bought them $3 or $4 online. They're right at your door, no problem. Well, that's not the case in the last week before the eclipse. Maybe some of you have been on a journey like we have. And so we're trying to find out where can we find these things. And we hear that there's a toy store in Wichita that's going to get a shipment in. And sure enough, we call and leave a reservation. And Nicole goes in on Friday and waits for hours and doesn't get one. And from the way that she described it, it is a crazy scene there at this toy store. And she gets a number and they say, well, you can come back tomorrow. We might be getting another shipment. And so, okay, so that's the plan. So yesterday we did get a call and we went back over. This time we all went over as a family. We were prepared for several hours waiting in line. Well, it's no problem. We walk right in. We're greeted at the door by the Sedgwick County Sheriff's deputy, keeping the peace there, which I'm grateful for. It was much less crazy, I hear, than what it was on Saturday. So it was a pretty fun thing. And so we're able to get these glasses. And these glasses, it's something you're going to use, just for a little bit tomorrow. But they have a great deal of worth. Did you look online, eBay or Amazon? They're selling them for several $100s if you could get them there by tomorrow, right? This idea of things that have worth, that have value in our lives. This is one of the key ideas that we're focused on in the message today. The root word for the word worship means something that has value or something that has worth. And today we're beginning a new series in which we are focusing on our discipleship pathway. I want to remind you about what that is. We live as disciples of Jesus Christ as we worship, grow, give, serve, and share. These are the expectations for our members. They're our invitation to life as followers of Jesus Christ here at First United Methodist Church. And so we're looking at worship today, what it is, how we experience it, and what difference it can make in our lives today. Also during this series, as we're taking a look at our discipleship pathway, we'll be studying the stories of the 12 apostles. These 12 folks, these 12 happen to be 12 guys who followed Jesus during his time here on earth. We're going to learn a little bit more about their story. And today, we're going to hear a little bit more about James and John. Now, when I was growing up, James and John, one of my favorite characters, because in one of the Gospels, when they're introduced, they have a nickname that Jesus gives them. They're called the Sons of Thunder. How cool is that, right? Sons of Thunder, James and John. So we're going to look at their story for us today and see what we can learn from them. So I want to remind you that James and John were the sons of Zebedee, and their mom's name was Salome. Salome, we actually know a little bit more about her. It's unfortunately a little bit unusual to hear more details about women in the scriptures, but we know about Salome because she also was one that came to follow Jesus. We hear that not only were her sons called to be Jesus' apostles, but she was one who followed after Jesus. And we know this because of the end of the story in the Gospels. We see that when at the scene of the crucifixion, when Jesus is being put to death, many of the disciples had ran away, and yet we hear that there were some folks who stayed around and watched. We see this in Mark chapter 15, verse 40. Some women were watching from a distance, including Mary Magdalene and Mary, the mother of James, the younger one, and Joseph and Salome. This is the mother of James and John. She's also mentioned as one of the women who are present at the resurrection after the crucifixion. 3 days later, they go to the tomb to prepare Jesus' body. Mark 16:1 says this, when the Sabbath was over, Mary Magdalene, Mary, the mother of James, and Salome brought spices so that they could go and anoint Jesus' dead body. And I think it's something to pay attention to because our families make a difference in who we are. But certainly we know more about James and John through the stories that we hear in the Gospels, but these brief mentions of Salome tell us something important. Our parents have something to do with the life of faith that we live today. And so we're doing everything we can to help equip families to help raise their children in the life of faith. James and John, of course, are one of the first to join Jesus in his call. We hear their story about how they come to follow Jesus in Matthew chapter 4. It says this, continuing on, Jesus saw another set of brothers, James, the son of Zebedee, and his brother John. They were in a boat with Zebedee, their father, repairing their nets. Jesus called them, and immediately they left the boat and their father and followed him. I want you to picture this story with James and John for just a minute. They're at their job. This is what they do for a living. Their father likely had a few other employees there in the fishing business, and they're in the middle of the workday. This guy comes walking off. He already has another couple fishermen walking with him, Peter and Andrew. We'll hear their story later in the series. But they come up to him, and Jesus says, "Come and follow me." And they quit in the middle of the day. They leave what they're doing. Not only that, they leave their boss, their dad, and immediately they follow Jesus. Now, what is it that they saw in Jesus that would make them act like that? I can't quite picture what that must have been like. Was there more of a conversation that went on? Was it something about Jesus' power and presence that made them want to leave what they were doing? They must have found something of worth, something of value in the person of Jesus that would make them want to leave their job, leave their family, and follow after him. And then we come to hear about their nickname, Sons of Thunder, as I mentioned. It's fantastic. I think it's a great nickname. And we don't know for certain, but perhaps it's because of their fiery attitude. We think that perhaps James may have been a little bit quick to anger, and we get some clue of this in one of these stories. Listen to this story from Luke chapter 9. As the time approached when Jesus was to be taken up into heaven, he determined to go to Jerusalem. He sent messengers on ahead of him. Along the way, they entered a Samaritan village to prepare for his arrival, but the Samaritan villagers refused to welcome him because he was determined to go to Jerusalem. When the disciples, James and John, these are the sons of thunder, when they saw this, they said, "Lord, do you want us to call fire down from heaven to consume them?" But Jesus turned and spoke sternly to them, and they went on to another village. Now picture this, right? So they come to this village, they say, "Well, you're not really welcome here." They don't say, "Okay, no problem, we'll go to the next village," or maybe try a little bit further down the road. They say, "Jesus, we want to call down fire on these people. Can we do that, please? Can we?" No, Jesus doesn't let them call down fire, but perhaps this gives us some idea about this, the attitude or perhaps the emotions of James and John, these sons of thunder. They were with Jesus in some of the most important stories of his life. We hear that he was with Peter at the resurrection of Jairus' daughter, a woman that Jesus raises from the dead. They were with Peter again at the transfiguration when Jesus' appearance is transformed on the mountain. It becomes dazzling white, and he's there with Elijah and Moses. And of course, we hear of their story of them asking for places of honor at Jesus' left and at Jesus' right when he comes again in glory. James and John were with Jesus at these critical moments in his ministry, and they were almost certainly on that boat on that day when the storm came and Jesus came to them walking on the water. It says that the disciples were there in the boat, and there's a terrible storm, and so they think we're about to be lost here, and they see Jesus walking to them on the water, and they would have seen their friend Peter jump out of the boat into the water and begin to walk on the water and then start to sink. And then when they get back in the boat, that the storm becomes utterly still and calm. Now, this passage is one you may have heard before, and we often look at that story and consider what does it mean to be Peter in that? The story of the one who steps out in faith or who fails to keep his eyes on Jesus at time and what that interaction is like. And yet I want to focus on the very last verse where it says this. When those in the boat worshiped Jesus and said, "You must be God's Son." What were they doing there in the boat? The scriptures say that they worshiped Jesus. But we can almost be certain that there were no pews there in the boat. There was certainly not a band or a bulletin or a preacher there. What were they doing when the scriptures say that they worshiped Jesus and said, "You must be God's Son"? So let's take a closer look at what does it mean to worship? How do we understand the value that it has for us today? And I think this passage points to at least two things that teach us about what worship is. And the first is worship does not have to happen here in this place. Worship can happen in our everyday lives. When we look up at the sky, when we look out at creation, when we see the neighborhood children playing, we can worship God and give thanks and say there is value, there is good, and praise be to God who's the creator of all this. You can worship wherever you are, at your home, on the road, at your job, and certainly also here in this place. But worship doesn't have to be here. They also recognize something that's important about Jesus. They look at Jesus and they say, you are God's Son. It's part of what we're doing in worship is we're recognizing that God is God, we are not. We are seek to live as sons and daughters of God, but sometimes we find ourselves far away from that. Sometimes we find ourselves so far away from the love of God that we don't even recognize it, but God's love is always there waiting for us. And we can turn and say, you are God's Son. And I don't have that all figured out, but I want to follow after you. I want to model my life after you, Jesus. That's part of what we're doing in worship. And then the story, if we back up, we remember that what was happening just before then was there was a crazy storm. They were fighting against the waves, and then there was peace and there was calm. And I don't know about you, but this is something that I experience in worship at times as well. And sometimes when I come to this place and this time to gather here, my life has been crazy. It feels like a storm, and it feels like I've been fighting against things in my life, and yet sometimes when we come to worship, there can be a sense of peace and calm. And I've heard from some of you describe what it's like to just walk into this space, and for some of you, just being here is a sense of peacefulness. And again, it doesn't have to be here, but that sense of calm and peace sometimes comes to us when we worship. There's power in worship. Because I believe that God is trying to change me. I think God is trying to change you. And sometimes I like to pretend that I've got my life all together, that I'm all the preacher that I might be, that I'm all the husband and the dad that I might be, but the truth is that I'm not. And so when I come to worship, part of me is recognizing that I'm not all who I might be. And when I come to worship, I know that God's Spirit can work inside me. And God can change us through worship. It's one of the ways that God's grace and God's love comes to us. It's one of the ways that we can experience hope and joy and find a sense of peace. God wants to change you and me, and this is the place where it happens. It's an environment for transformation, being here, listening for God, offering ourselves back to God, all of these things helping it make it possible for God to be at work in our lives. And of course, sometimes when we come to worship, we find that other people notice. I imagine if you would have been on the Sea of Galilee. For the apostles were probably not the only ones on the sea at that day. There were others that were fighting against the storm, but they don't have any idea what's going on. For others in the Sea of Galilee, all that they know is that there was a crazy storm, and then all of a sudden, it was still. I imagine when they got back to shore, the word traveled along the edge of the shore there, and perhaps they found out that this has something to do about Jesus. And do you remember James and John? They were on that boat when he came on board. When you come to worship, when you begin to shape your life after Jesus, you begin to see that things might change. Other people notice the pattern in your life, the way that you're living, and they say, hey, what is it that's different? What's changed? What's going on? And worship might be a part of your story. People will notice when you come to worship. I imagine sometimes that worship is like a well of water that's been there for a long time. We've been reading our children the stories of Little House on the Prairie, the story of the Ingalls family, Laura and Mary and Ma and Pa. And one of the things that they do is they dig a well. And they seek to have fresh water. And sometimes worship is like that. Maybe a well that's been there for generations. We're certainly not the first people to worship here at First United Methodist Church. And long before El Dorado was even on a map, that people were seeking to worship God. and there will be people here long after us. Just like a well that's there and people across the generations can drink from that fresh water, so it is with worship. That sometimes we come and it seems much the same, and yet always it's new and it's inviting and it's life-giving. It's a sacred time to be able to meet God, a moment that's set apart. I know that God is with me all the time, and yet somehow in worship, it's something different and something significant and beautiful and good. We come close to God, and God comes close to us. It's one of those thin places when we see that God is with us. The good news is that worship can change us, that we can become more like Christ when we worship God here, when we worship God at our homes, wherever we may be. This is one of the ways that God changes us. And so my invitation for you is to seek to worship. Be here on Sunday mornings. Pay attention to the way that God is at work in your world. Worship God every day, because worship is powerful. People come here every week needing encouragement, comfort, assurance, forgiveness, grace, encouragement, conviction. Maybe you find yourself in need of that today. Our lives can be changed simply because we gather to worship. Because when we worship, we offer ourselves to God. Will you pray with me? Oh God, we give you thanks for the opportunity to worship, to gather together here in this place, to listen and to look for your presence with us every day of our lives. We ask that you would change our hearts. Help us to live as your sons and daughters. And help us together to change the world, fueled by the fire of your Spirit that we find here in this place. We pray all these things in your holy name. Amen.